people who are here. Oh, I'm going to close the door so we don't hear noise from outside. Hold on. So good morning. Welcome. My name is Nephelie Andonyadis. Um, and we have an hour together in which I will share some information about living with dementia in community. I'll share a little bit about myself. I have a lot of information. This is a huge topic. So I've tried to sort of sort information that would be useful to community members and those who want to support, maybe volunteer with, engage with, connect with folks living in your community who might be experiencing and living with dementia or memory loss. There is much more. So Erica and Anne from Palisades Village are on. If Erica and Anne, if you can sort of monitor the chat as we go. I can't really see people and I can't see the chat while I'm also looking at slides. So if you have a question, feel free to put it in the chat. Erica and Anne can use their judgment if you want to interrupt me and bring something up while we're in the middle of my sharing all these slides. Otherwise, we'll allow some time at the end for questions and we can have some discussion at that point. So I'm glad you're here. So I will begin here. My name's Nephelie. As I mentioned, my background is in arts and education. I'm a theater artist and a longtime educator, and recently have added gerontologist to the areas that I study and practice in. I also, as it happens, serve as president of the board of directors of the Palisades Village, and I grew up in the Palisades, so I'm a born and raised in the district. This first slide just is a little bit about myself and what brings me to this work. And I will say that I think, as is true for many of us who work in the aging space, that our personal and our family experiences inspire us and bring us to this work. This is an image of my parents in about 2015. My mother had Alzheimer's disease and memory loss. She lived with dementia for many years. My father was her primary caregiver. And she's standing there at an exhibition of artwork at Iona Senior Services. She went there to their adult day health program and became an artist. She developed a whole new role identity in the years she lived with dementia through drawing and painting. And I'll talk about the power of the arts a little bit later on, but I share it here to say that my experience of being with my mother as she went through the changes that dementia brought opened a huge window for me and a huge, deep well of curiosity in me. Because while many of our friends and family, and my father certainly felt this, felt the loss of who she had been. They were married 65 years. I, for some peculiar reason, quirk of personality, found that she was amazing to be with. And I found it really fascinating to experience how she was changing, because while she forgot the past and she did not know my name, she held on to like the essence of herself. She had her tastes and her manners. She was very well cared for, and we were very lucky. She was quite joyful in the years that she lived with dementia, and she was transformed through art. So, long story short, that's what brought me back to DC. I was born and raised in DC. I lived away for several decades. I did come back to support my parents. And since my mother's death, have really pursued working in aging space with an interest in how we live in community and how we can improve our systems of care. I have a lot of experience, which I share here. I earned a degree in aging and health. I've worked in adult day health programs. I've worked in a senior living community developing programs. I've worked with the villages pretty extensively and partnered with other organizations around DC. TimeSlips, I'll tell you a little bit about that later. I'm a certified facilitator and trainer for TimeSlips, which is an approach to a creative engagement for people with memory loss and dementia. And I'm a teaching artist as well. So that's a little bit of what I've been doing for the past 8 or 9 years. Next slide. Okay. I will also share that I'm in it to help change the system. I have an agenda. So I will share information from some of my training about dementia, what it is, some of the symptoms, and a little bit of the sort of general knowledge about it. But what brings me here is a desire to actually create a more dementia-friendly community. I believe the villages are a really strong way to empower people and to begin to make that change. I bring a background as a community engaged arts maker and as a teacher, so I bring a belief in the power of community to make change and to support people. I also want to counter some general cultural narratives about how we age, who's responsible, how independent we are, what it means to begin to lose independence, because I actually believe we are all interdependent. And I think that some of the strength of intergenerational community and some of the work of volunteer-based organizations like the villages lies in recognizing that interdependence and that there is an exchange that happens. I'll talk about care partners as opposed to caregivers and receivers, because again, I find that sort of transactional nature of like who gives, who receives is more complex than that. And it's really a partnership that we work together. So that's some of my agenda and what brings me here. These are some goals for this hour together. I'll give you an overview of dementia with some definitions. I'll also introduce some tools and strategies to help individual community members, to help empower you to find a way to connect and stay in relationship with perhaps people living with dementia that you might know. I'll share some do's and don'ts, just some checklists, some insights into ways to approach this work, communication strategies. I'll point towards some further resources and references. There are many. I named some in this presentation. There are more. Maybe there's a follow-on where we can look at more readings and resources. And ultimately, I think we have to find ways to reduce the shame and stigma that's often associated with dementia, with a diagnosis, and with what people feel when they might know somebody or be diagnosed. So I'm going to give you a little demographic overview first. Some of this information might be familiar to you. It's in the news these days, but the chart on the left is a population pyramid. It used to be that the pyramid, like the one on the left here, can you all see my cursor? It was a pyramid, meaning at the bottom, younger people, so it goes through ages, right? So we had more people born, youth, as we advanced through older and older ages up to age 85 here, there were fewer and fewer people living because lifespan, longevity was shorter in 1960 than it is projected to be in 2060 or than it is today. With the advent of things like public hygiene, clean water, vaccinations, advances in care for heart disease and heart attack, and various other sort of social and medical advances, longevity has increased and we are living longer. So that pyramid is turning into this rectangle, meaning there are more and more people alive today who are older. And as you've heard in the news, with the baby boomer generation, as we move through, like this whole cohort of people moving through, we have more and more people living longer. The question that, of course, comes up is how do we live longer well? How do we maintain well-being as we live longer? The chart on the right just introduces this idea of social determinants of health. So while genetics plays a role and medical care, meaning clinical practice, plays a role in our overall health and well-being, what the chart is just showing us is that 20% of what drives health and longevity is that clinical medical piece. 80% are the social determinants. So that includes lifestyle, that includes diet and nutrition, that includes the neighborhood you live in. And in DC, the stark contrast is pretty extreme. It's true of many cities in this country where there's at least there's a 20-year difference in lifespan, expected lifespan for people who live in Ward 3, for example, versus people who live in Ward 8. So your zip code, the sort of takeaway is your zip code might be more important than your genetic code when we look at longevity and health span. I raise this to say part of my mission is to support care systems for all older adults, and we just need to recognize that social determinants play a big role in this as we look across our communities. This chart is just showing a little bit about the from the National Institute on Aging, sort of the increased risk. We'll talk a little bit about risk factors for developing dementia. Alzheimer's, and I'll talk about this in another slide, but Alzheimer's is one disease that can cause dementia. Dementia itself is an umbrella term. There are many, many different potential causes for dementia. But this looks at, there is an increased risk factor with age. So while dementia is not part of aging necessarily, while it's not just because of aging, getting older is one of the risk factors. So that's kind of what this is showing you here. As you advance from age 64 to 90 plus, the risk increases of developing dementia. And then these different colored lines also break it down by different race and ethnic characteristics. And then this slide projects to 2050, we're here in 2026, that the rates will continue to increase. And that is partly due to the population aging. There's some statistics here. Worldwide, 55 million people are living with Alzheimer's and other dementias. About 6.5 million of those are in the United States, and that number is expected to increase. So I want to start here by addressing the sort of what I often have found to be the dominant narrative of Alzheimer's and dementia, which is that it is a loss and that it is a loss of self. And I'll just say, here's where that comes from. This here is Dr. Alois Alzheimer, and his first patient, Auguste Dater. She was the first Alzheimer's patient. He noticed that she had these unusual experiences of short-term memory loss. She lived in an institution. He was a medical doctor. And after her death, he examined her brain, and he found the sort of characteristic plaques and tangles, which are the physiological changes that happen in the brain that cause these neural connections to fail, which are the cause of memory loss, some of the symptoms of dementia for Alzheimer's. So his name was given to that identification of that disease. And this quote, "I have lost myself," comes from this one patient and Dr. Alzheimer's. And I'm just here to say I don't think this is true. In my experience, this is not true, that Alzheimer's and dementia is not a loss of self. And that part of our work and community is to find some ways to counter this narrative, to counter the narrative that it is all loss and no gains, to counter the narrative that somebody is lost, that they are a long goodbye, that they should put their affairs in order and approach the end of life. Because in fact, what I know to be true is many people live with dementia, live well with dementia, and remain very much themselves, even with changes in their brain that impact behavior and affect and that require a different kind of support and care systems. I will, yeah, I'll say a couple more things on the next slide. So in the red box here, I pulled a few statements from one of my resources, which is DEAR stands for, I will remember, uh, Education, Engagement, and Resource Center. I forget the first one, diagnosis perhaps. It's out of the University of Nevada. They're a remarkable center for some research and some proactive engagement practices working with people with dementia. And so, in fact, a person with dementia is not their disease. At no point does dementia take away personhood. And we'll talk a lot more about personhood and person-centeredness later. So this is that umbrella image. Dementia is the umbrella term. There's many different symptoms of dementia. Memory loss is one of them. And these are some of the types of dementia. Alzheimer's is the most common. 60 to 80% of people with dementia are diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. Vascular dementia is about a reduced blood flow to the brain that also causes changes in the brain. Lewy body, frontotemporal dementia, these are different sort of physiological mechanisms that are impacting different parts of the brain that will cause changes that impact people's thinking and communication. There are some other conditions like Huntington's disease and Parkinson's disease that also sometimes will present with some symptoms of dementia. A mixed dementia is generally a mix of like Alzheimer's plus frontotemporal. A lot of these are hard to diagnose positively. It's often a diagnosis of elimination, eliminating other causes. With scans, they have some improved ways of diagnosing. It used to be even just, I think, 10, 15 years ago that the only way to definitively diagnose what kind of dementia somebody had was posthumously if you actually looked at the brain. That said, while somebody is living, and the whole frame for this is how do we support people who are living with dementia, it's helpful to have this knowledge, but ultimately, as someone who I work with who has dementia, has Alzheimer's, says, if you know one person with dementia, you know one person with dementia. In each case, we're working with individuals and finding strategies and ways to support those people. Next slide. Okay, so here are, I have to move this so I can see my notes. So this is a list of some of the symptoms, and there is some variation in how symptoms and behaviors might present based on the disease model. Dementia impacts memory loss, that's a main one, but it affects several different areas of the brain and capacity, including complex attention, executive function, memory, and also learning. The way the brain learns with dementia is different. People with dementia do continue to learn and grow. It's different than it might have been for their past. It can affect language, different ways of affecting speech and language, perceptual motor function, and also social cognition. So those are the general areas of brain function that are impacted. And then this sort of details Alzheimer's and how it might be different from Parkinson's, Lewy body, vascular dementia, etc. The disease does progress. So being diagnosed with one of these diseases, which is a change in the brain, is a progressive process. We can come back to these if we want to talk in more detail. I'm going to keep moving so we have time to talk. So this is just diagramming that sense of the progression. This one here, stage 3, MCI, is mild cognitive impairment. So the general category of dementias is cognitive impairment. That is the overall problem. With mild cognitive impairment, it's often the first time somebody might notice symptoms, might notice memory losses or confusion or disorientation. There might be some things that trigger someone to worry that they might be developing mild cognitive impairment. There are some screening tests that a primary care physician can complete. Ultimately, diagnosis really requires a neurologist, a specialist, because it can be helpful to sort of know more and more detail what kind of dementia one has in order to come up with a plan of care. And then it sort of progresses through these stages, mild Alzheimer's disease. This was looking at the Alzheimer's model. This chart is pulled from the Alzheimer's Association. And then it progresses to moderate and to severe. Changes in sleep can happen, more disorientation, and more support with what are called activities of daily living, which common sense, you know what those are, activities of daily living, but they're also a diagnostic tool. There's a list of specific activities of daily living that include eating independently, bathing, dressing, toileting, ambulating, walking, moving around. So those are sort of the basic fundamental activities that we need in order to live. And with increases in the disease, people need more assistance with those tasks. Towards the end, very, very severe end stage dementia, the body begins to forget even motor function. So for example, forgetting how to swallow, right? That the body begins to sort of lose some of those cues. But that comes late. There's a really long period of time when someone might be moving through stages 1 through 5 and still be in relationship, communicative, and engaging with the world. So in terms of risk factors and what we can do, the 6 pillars of brain health are really similar to the 6 pillars of heart health and to any other kind of sense of health and well-being. Essentially, heart health is brain health. So things like getting good sleep, eating nourishing food, keeping the mind engaged and active, physical movement, keep moving. And also, and this one's really important, I think, for this context, is social connection, remaining in relationship with community members, with family members. Social connection has a tremendous protective force. And we will talk a little bit more, we'll talk a lot more about that. So everybody's risk, it's not possible to 100% avoid developing dementia, especially as we age. Just age is a risk factor, but we can reduce the risk. So lifestyle choices can help reduce the risk. There is also a genetic factor. It is actually possible if you do like 23andMe, you can screen to see if you have the APO3 genetic mutation, which increases your chances. It doesn't guarantee that you will or will not. Any individual will or will not get dementia, develop dementia. And then environmental factors. And I shared that slide of the social determinants of health to share that some of the factors are beyond our control. So all of those play into the risk one has of developing dementia. It is a little bit unpredictable. And I'm not going to go deeply into this in terms of the research and the pharmacological approaches and the medicine, that there's a lot of work being done, research looking for a cure. There are some medications that help with symptoms. There are some trials, some drug trials going on, trying to see some of these new medications, how they might slow the progress of the development of the symptoms, but there is no cure. So for me, and this is where I'm going to pivot a little bit in the conversation, for me, the task is, without a cure, how do we focus on care? How do we not dismiss people with the diagnosis? How do we continue to be in relationship and support folks? So that's our question. Without a cure, how do we reframe the conversation to be about care? So I offer here a couple of ideas, just to say, one, that what I'm talking about is a social model. a sort of psychosocial model of support for people with dementia versus a medical model. Medical model is quite limited in this case. And so without a cure, a person-centered approach to care is probably our best way forward. Person-centered says that we actually focus on the individual and we begin to understand the unique interests and curiosities of someone and address their needs, which can be more difficult as someone's communication changes to understand what those needs are. And so we'll talk more about that. I'll mention that, and certainly COVID and the quarantine and our experiences of surviving the pandemic have shed a light on social isolation and how detrimental that is to health and well-being generally, and very much detrimental to those with dementia. The United Kingdom, if you don't know, has in fact created a position called the Minister of Loneliness to begin to address a pandemic of loneliness and how it is detrimental to our health. I'll just offer this as a little mnemonic to think is can we change our approach to be accept, affirm, and connect. Connection, social connection, human connection, finding authentic and meaningful connections begins to be one of our major tools. Social prescribing is new. They're doing some trials of this to see if there's a cost benefit, but essentially, the proposition is, could a physician prescribe social connection? Since medications have limited effect on curing, could there be a prescription for dance classes? Could there be a prescription for taking an art class or a journal writing or a poetry class or something like that? So all of these are beginning to really demonstrate positive impacts that save money in the long run, perhaps. Meaning and purpose. How do we help support people's meaning and purpose in life? So we have a purpose, we have meaningful relationships and meaningful things to do and engage with. I'll talk a little bit more about the relationship and the impacts of arts engagement on health and well-being. And I'll show you, I think it's in the next slide, I'll show you the primary researcher who's done a study of that work. But these little bullet points here in terms of we can continue to learn and grow. It might be different than what we used to do in the past if we develop dementia. So a sense of control, a sense of mastery, a sense of developing a skill, meaningful social engagement and connection. So these are critical. All right. Oh, okay. So dispelling a couple of myths and misconceptions about living with dementia and changing our language. Words matter, and how we talk about these things matter. So, for example, in the red box, instead of suffering from, and I've heard people who do tremendous work in Alzheimer's research use this language of people suffering from the scourge of memory loss and Alzheimer's, right? Those people, whoever we are alive and present. So rather than talk about suffering victimhood, how about shifting our language to really talk about what it means to live with this condition? Increasingly, people are able to live with dementia more like a chronic condition that with support can be managed to a degree. So that's our focus. And again, these are it's a list of misconceptions that come from people living with dementia who are advocates for themselves. People living with dementia do continue to grow and learn. Dementia impacts communication, but there are other forms of communication like body language, tone of voice. Communication is always possible. The majority of people living with dementia live in their own home, in their community. Not in institutions, not in facilities, and that is a good thing. Since there is no medical fix, what do we do? Okay, bear with me here. I'm going to share a little tiny bit of gerontological theory with you because I think this is a really useful one. This is M. Powell Lawton's theory of environmental press. And what this diagram shows, essentially, up on the left-hand column from low to high on this y-axis is what he called competence or capacity. So from low capacity or competence to high capacity or competence. And then along the bottom is environmental press, which is essentially like the challenges of our environment, like what's going on, right? What stressors are there in my environment? And what he's diagramming here is that there is a dynamic relationship between an individual's capacity and the stress of their environment, and we adapt. So I'll use myself for example. I tend to be a pretty high capacity person. I have a lot of capacity, I have a lot of competencies. So even when there are stressors in my environment, if there are physical issues going on, if I'm up against a clock, if I'm up against a deadline, if things are breaking and I have to fix them, right? If there are things in my environment that are stressing me, I'm pretty adaptable. And I can find a way to positively adapt to continue to function pretty well. At some point, I break. I'm like, okay, I got to, something's got to give. For somebody with less capacity or somebody who might be developing cognitive impairment, as our capacity reduces, we are less able to adapt to challenges in our environment. Those challenges can become barriers and can become insurmountable. And it's a dynamic relationship. So what does it mean if someone is losing capacity? Perhaps instead of working really hard to change them, which they may not have capacity to do, we can change the environment. We can adapt. We can adapt how we approach them because we're more flexible, or we can build an environment and create an environment that is more supportive. And what the diagram is also showing is when we do that, when we create a more supportive home environment, whatever community environment, capacity also increases. People become more able. We can increase agency and ownership. So that dynamic relationship I find to be very powerful and a very powerful way of thinking about this. If anybody's familiar with like Montessori education, that's the basic principle of Montessori education, is to create a prepared environment where children can follow their curiosity, grow and adapt based on materials provided, spaces created. So anyway, I find this to be a useful theory, and thanks for indulging me in looking at a little bit of gerontological theory. And there's more to talk about that, but I'll leave that there for now. So here are some suggestions that come from the National Council of Certified Dementia Practitioners of ways to create a more dementia-friendly environment. Rather than focus on the person, let's create a space where they can flourish. Meaningful engagement and social connections. How do we build that into the environment? And the environment is not just the physical environment, but also the social construct, the social environment. Creating a sense of belonging, something that is familiar and comfortable. Finding a way to foster independence and autonomy so people can spontaneously engage in something that might draw their attention. Providing safety and security, making sure that we don't have hazards in the space that we have to navigate around. Creating calmness and tranquility, including nature. There's a huge benefit to access to the outdoors, the sky, plants, nature. And then engaging the senses. And I found this to be true, to go back to my personal story with my mother, and I have found it to be true with many of the people I've worked with, is that while specific like event memories or names might be lost, sense memories and a response to sensory input is really powerful and often remains. So a sense of touch, a capacity to make something with one's hands or just work with hands. Scents, smells can sort of awaken all kinds of possibilities and thoughts. Music is really, really, really powerful. So sound, all of those senses are and being mindful of ones that are stimulating and ones that are calming and ones that might engage. All of the senses can be really powerful ways to create a much more dementia-friendly sensory environment. How are we doing on time? Okay, all right. Next slide. Okay, so I'll talk a little bit about communication. Given that communication, language are one of the areas impacted by dementia. And I want to, again, I'm going to try to change our language a little bit. Sometimes, often, people are referred to by a behavior they might be exhibiting. And we think of, and I've seen this happen in many, many settings where you have to kind of manage problem behaviors. Somebody might have a problem behavior and we have to kind of control it or manage it in some way. So if we flip that, I would say behaviors are a form of communication. And a behavior, one that seems unusual or different or socially not the norm, is often an expression of a need, perhaps an unmet need. So if we could kind of shift the way we think about that to a person-centered approach and begin to like do a little detective work and say, okay, if something's happening, somebody's holding on to something they won't let go of, somebody's unwilling to come with me and go down the steps and ride in my car. Somebody, something is coming up. Somebody is, quote, um, uh, getting up and leaving, and they want to go somewhere and they're not safe. They might get lost. Is there actually something that that person wants or needs? And can we find a way to understand what they're communicating through that behavior? So communication is essential, and it's really important that we find ways to communicate. We want to take the person's point of view, walk in their shoes, figure out from their perspective, what do they need? What do they want? And then can we address that? Can we walk by their side? Can we understand what's going on there? Nonverbal communication, affect are huge. We know this, I think, from our own experience. It's even more important if somebody is losing expressive speech and is unable. Often with dementia, words will get mixed up. The wrong word will come out, or someone can't recall the word for something. If we insist that the person say the right word, oh, do you mean this? No, it's not that. It should be this. We are likely to induce a feeling of shame that they're wrong and that they don't know. So instead, maybe we go with them and we figure out that we're going to call this something else. This, if we don't remember this is a pen, we'll just call it the black thing. That's fine. What should we do with the black thing? Can we go on that journey and kind of understand what somebody is communicating without insisting that they recall something that they may not be able to recall or to say? Visual communication can be really important. Visual cues are helpful. The other one is to figure out how to be present in the moment. I'll talk about this later when I talk about time slips. One of the greatest super tools, powers of being in relationship with somebody with dementia is the practice of improvisation, going with the flow, being in the moment, accepting what you receive and figuring out how to kind of go with that. One of the don'ts you'll see in the list coming up is please don't contradict somebody with dementia. They don't have the capacity to process that. Let's figure out what they meant. And then this goes back to referencing Lawton's theory of environmental press. We may not be able to expect that someone has the adaptive capacity to make the change, remember the word, speak the right word. So therefore, we can adapt. We can make a change. We can change the environment. We can adapt our approach in order to support somebody. And there's a quote there, people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but they will never forget how you made them feel. So that sense of affect and connection is truly important. Some barriers to communication, and I've referenced these when I've talked about sort of changing the narrative, changing the paradigm. Stigma, there's still a lot of stigma. There's a lot of fear associated with memory loss, dementia. Elders speak is a barrier to able to speak. I don't know if anybody knows what I mean by this, but it's sort of infantilizing somebody, calling them by diminutive, honey, sweetie pie, that kind of thing, or talking in a baby voice to somebody. I would encourage us to not use that and to speak in a normal, respective adult tone of voice. Other communication barriers is a sensory loss. So it's important to be aware if somebody can or cannot hear us, or if there's vision loss, or if there's other sensory loss that could be impacting someone's capacity and ability to be communicated with, to communicate. I will say that in general, hearing loss is extremely isolating. People who struggle to hear well will often sort of just retreat, and it's too hard to hear, especially if there's like competing noise, or like a busy restaurant or something is often really hard for somebody to hear. And it has a cumulative effect. So not being able to hear will exacerbate and increase some symptoms. So that awareness around someone's ability to hear and see is important. There could be other health issues. Somebody could be unwell, fever or infection or something else could be going on. And then these environmental barriers like extraneous noises, clutter, disarray, a lack of a place to kind of comfortably sit and be in communication with somebody. So this is a list. Again, words matter. Do remember person first, person-centered, personhood. This is what I said before. The closest thing we have to a cure is person-centered care. And this is from a list created by Kate Swaffer. I have her name there. She's the founder of Dementia Action Alliance. She's an activist and an advocate for people living with dementia. She lives in Australia. She's part of several online fora that I've been a part of, and she's created a list. I think her list is 20 things not to say. This is 10 of them. So coming directly from somebody who has been diagnosed and is living with dementia. Don't tell us we're wrong. Don't argue about trivial things. Don't say, remember when. Don't call us victims. Don't refer to us as demented, vacant, an empty shell, the long goodbye. We are always still here. Don't call me honey love or anything other than my preferred name. Don't call me by a behavior. So don't call me a wanderer. Don't call me something which is a behavior. Always think person, a person who is acting or desires or doing something in particular. Don't say I already told you that. Don't assume I can't answer for myself. I have found working with people with dementia that there's often like a lag. If somebody is trying to express themselves verbally, I have to be quite patient and offer affect of warmth and listening and wait to act so that that person can find the way to communicate. I will also sometimes, as I'm listening, if the words aren't all making sense and I can't figure it out, I assume it's me. I'm trying to understand. Sometimes I'll echo back. Here's what I heard. Is this it? Can I get it right? And ask somebody. Okay. So now these are some, I'm going to shift into looking at some creative engagement strategies. This is a powerful tool, arts engagement. This is a lot of my work to challenge the tragedy narrative, ways that we can think about building on strengths that people still have rather than grieving the losses. And there is grief and there is loss. I don't want to deny that or diminish that. It's very real. And I find to focus on strengths and capacities that we can enjoy is life affirming and is a way forward and is a way to remain in community, whereas the grief is not as productive. So Dr. Gene Cohen, I'll talk a little bit about him. He worked here in DC at the National Institute on Aging. He was at George Washington University, and he conducted a creativity and aging study where he actually measured the impact of arts engagement on physical health and well-being. He has since died, so that research continues, but with others. But that study was like a seminal. It was a pivotal study in demonstrating the protective capacity and the restorative capacity of the arts. These are some others here. Dr. Pia Kontos is Canadian, who really talks about citizenship and the ways in which a medical system can rob individuals of their rights of citizenship, that we sometimes don't consider people with dementia as full citizens, and yet they are. We are, with all the rights there are. Stephen Post, this is where I brought what I think is really useful as a strategy is accept, affirm, connect. I'll talk some more about Ann Basting, who is the founder of TimeSlips, which is an organization to support transforming care systems with some very actionable tools. I'll give you that toolbox before we break. Local organization Dance Exchange in Tacoma Park works with intergenerational movers and communities to redefine how dance can inform community. And then there's some more. The Coalition to Reimagine Dementia. Meet Me in MoMA is an arts engagement program at the Museum of Modern Art. Opening Minds Through Art is here. Dementia Action Alliance. And then DEAR, this is the one I've referenced, Dementia Engagement Education and Research Program out of the University of Nevada. Here's a picture of Dr. Gene Cohen. So the outcomes that he demonstrated are in these two red boxes. So older adults engaged in professionally led groups improved measurably in physical, mental, and social health. So less need for medication, fewer doctor visits, elevated mood, reduced depression and loneliness, and an increase in the number of activities. So the more engaged people were, the more engaged people became. And the critical factors there were that sense of mastery, of learning something, of getting better at something over time, and the social connections, being part of the choir, being part of the group that got together to build something together. All right, so TimeSlips is one organization that works in this area. It's one that I work with, and I'm going to play this very short video that introduces TimeSlips.
What is TimeSlips? We are a nonprofit inspiring a global movement to bring meaning and joy to late life through creative engagement. Let me show you what I mean. When the changes that come with aging meet the demands of our daily lives, it can be difficult to connect. Even if we want to connect, it can be hard to know how. When we do try to connect, our impulse is to draw on the past. But for people with memory loss, this approach can lead to shame and embarrassment, focusing on who the person was rather than accepting and valuing who they are now. TimeSlips offers another approach, to shift from the expectation of memory to the freedom of imagination. In the emotional and symbolic language of the arts, there are no wrong answers. People we thought might be lost to us, we can reach with sound and movement, with words and images. We can find joy again, together, connecting through creativity, one-on-one, at the bedside or kitchen table, or in groups, at libraries, memory cafes, museums, or in assisted living, senior centers, or skilled nursing. TimeSlips is fueling a creative care revolution to change the way we think about late life and how we engage with elders, from a time of isolation and loss to a time of growth and meaningful connection. Connect through creativity with TimeSlips. Learn more, timeslips.org.
So to summarize sort of the creative arts engagement piece, TimeSlips is one organization. I named some others that offer some tools and some strategies for the work. It is strengths-based, person-centered creative engagement, and it's a great starting place. And I would offer it's useful in everyday interactions as well. And these are some of the positive impacts that we've talked about. And so here's a quick, all right, I'm going to talk for 2 more minutes and then we'll have time for questions and discussion at the end. So this here are the three sort of basic tools for a time slips approach. Um, as you saw in the video and as I referenced in Jean Cohen's work and others, time slips can be like an artistic engagement practice where an artist or a teaching artist might lead the process for a project. But it can also, and this is where it's, I think, a way to think about how do we change the system and how do we change relationships and build connection. It can also be a tool to use in moments, in present moments, in little snippets of time. So here they are. The first rule, and this is all based, I'll just back up and say Anne Basting, her background is as a theater artist. And so some of this comes from theater practice and from the practice of improvisation, which is a way to generate work. So the first rule is yes and. Essentially, anything that is offered, you say yes. And this has been my job in programming and creating programs in many, many different communities is to say yes. Can I say yes? Yes, but is different from yes and. Yes, but is a lot like no, right? Yes, and says, I affirm you, I've heard you, and can take it in another direction. We can redirect, we can build, we can add something on. But if I'm going to invite somebody who might have memory loss or dementia or other symptoms to give me an answer, I'm going to accept that answer, whatever it is. You just kind of keep dancing. So affirming an answer, responding to who the person is now, as opposed to what the answer might have been in the past, and truly addressing that person in the moment. So yes, and is the first rule. The second one is to offer open-ended questions. So an open-ended question is one that actually is not a yes or no question, but that could have a multitude of answers. Anne Basting in the TimeSlips calls them beautiful questions. Is it a question that could open us up to wonder, open us up to imagination, open us up to responding to the moment we're in? Side note here, a lot of dementia training will advise care partners to simplify the question. And in certain instances, I think that is correct, right? Too many options, somebody may not be able to answer. And if it's a simple question of, do you need to go to the bathroom? Would you like to eat this or this, right? Those might be questions where it makes sense because it's important to get something accomplished in a timely way, to simplify the question so that we can understand somebody's preference. But this is separate from that. This is in an instance where we're trying to engage with somebody. We're trying to create some meaning and some purpose and some way to be in relationship because we know that relationships are critical. And that is where I would suggest that we reframe it and explore this idea of imagination. Can we co-create together? Can we imagine what's outside the window? Could we make something up? I lead a lot of time slip sessions, and I'm always like, well, just make it up. We can make it up right now. We can call it something else. So a beautiful question is one that opens us to a shared path of discovery. We can reframe the conversation. They can be very simple, and sometimes these become very profound. People find ways to respond that I found super meaningful and beautiful. And then the third tool here is proof of listening. So if we've asked a question and we've gotten a response, we want to affirm that we heard. Because often people with dementia are talked about, are put aside. If somebody has difficulty communicating, it can happen that we dismiss what they might say. And so this says, I'm going to prove that I listened. I heard you. I'll repeat it back. I'll make sure I understood. And so these three elements become sort of a little cycle, like, just repeat. You can ask a beautiful question. You can say yes, and you can proof of listening. You can give proof of listening, and then you could continue. And that is a way to engage and connect with somebody. All right, that was a lot of information. I think the question I just posed here, how could time slips be used in a community setting? That's something to think about to create just meaningful moments. One way that time slips has used it is in trying to infuse this idea into systems. One example is with Meals on Wheels deliveries. They created cards, like nice little cards that had a beautiful question on them. And the question might be, what is the most beautiful sound to you? Or a question might be, how do you welcome a guest to your home? Or if your feet could talk, what might they say to you, right? It's an open-ended question. So they put the questions on cards. And so when the delivery people were delivering Meals on Wheels, they had the card and they said, would you like to hear the question of the day? And they asked the question, and it inspired like a little conversation, a 5-minute conversation, which for many of the folks receiving Meals on Wheels deliveries, that was the only conversation with a human being they were having that day. So it begins to be a way that we could find those places to connect that can support people and change relationships. And I think that's my last slide. So I'm going to end the show and stop sharing. Hello. We have a couple minutes at the end. Thank you, everybody.
One thing in the chat that came up under the do's and don'ts, kind of, Frank said, don't talk to me as if I am not there.
Yes, 100%. That's a great one, Frank.
Yeah, don't talk. I often found this with home care aides, that they would talk to me. I cared for my mom for 10 years with Alzheimer's in my home, and the aides would talk to me about my mother as if my mother were not sitting right there. And it drove me crazy because I always felt that she could understand far more than she could communicate. And it was sort of a way of lessening her as a person. But let me just say, I love the presentation. Overall, it's really so person-centered, which is so important about, I'm going to cry saying it, maintaining the dignity of the individual with memory loss or the deeply forgetful, or and I have 6 sisters who would come and visit me and my mother, and they had such a hard time trying, because it was such a stark difference each time they came to see her. They had such a hard time accepting that she was still there. She was different, and I kept saying to them, you just have to celebrate this part of her that we never knew. It's still her, and there are still other parts of her that are there. So if, for example, there were a few of us, if a couple of sisters or even some of my nieces and nephews would come, if we would start a conversation about something that happened in my childhood, eventually my mother could figure out a way to enter that conversation and be a part of it. And it was almost like we could provide a context that she could then participate in, and she got great joy out of it. But if we spent the whole time, or if they spent the whole time saying, gee, she can't walk anymore, and she can't tell us if she likes A or B, or I miss this, they're missing the person that is still right in front of them. So anyway, enough. I just loved what you said today.
Thank you so much, Frank. I appreciate that. And I will just share, because I have had the great privilege, I work with a lot of people with dementia, to hear testimony from people, and I know this to be true, who receive a diagnosis, and the doctor will give a diagnosis and then will turn and look at the care partner and stop talking. Even in the medical office, will stop talking to the individual who has received this diagnosis. So that's why I say it's huge. It's in the water, it's in the system. So thinking about the ways that at a grassroots community level, we can begin to make those changes, I think, in terms of how we interact. And how to change that. And Frank, I had, I think, a similar experience, which is for some reason I was engaged with my mother and was like enjoying the present. And the rest of my family and many of the friends were held on to the loss that she wasn't the person that she had been before. So I know it's hard to work through that.
Yeah.
And people, people still have feeling states, right? Like that capacity to um, have emotional connection is huge.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, my mother couldn't have told you my name, but she knew that she trusted me. She knew that she felt safe, and she was fun to be with. If I would just like shift my frame, which is why I shared the theory piece, is we have to shift our frame. We cannot burden an individual and blame and shame.
Nephelie,
Yes.
thank you so much. And thank you, Frank, also for such personal examples that you lived through, both of you. And for me as a volunteer, with Palisades Village, and I visit one person in particular with dementia, but also we've had an aunt that had dementia and we're very close to her. And so I really appreciated what you mentioned about being present, because you just don't have to talk even. Sometimes just be there, hold their hands, go with what they want and what the cues they give you. Because we're so trained in this society of like talk, 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 and that's what people want, and kind of entertain them. And when you see the caregivers too at homes, that's what they do. They blast the TV and they need to give them all these activities and celebrate all these birthdays, which are wonderful. But then the person's not even there in that moment. You can see that it's too loud to begin with. The celebrations that I've experienced
Mhm.
have been very loud. And thinking, if it bothers me, imagine, and you can tell in their facial expressions that they would have preferred something very quiet. But it's very hard to train people, and it's so necessary in these homes. But anyway, going back to what I was saying, the being present is so important, and and go with their cues. What do they want? What do they'll show you.
Yeah, I think it's
Yes.
definitely a way of listening, Claudia, a
Mhm.
way of listening and also of receiving cues and also of giving cues.
Yes.
Sometimes it is
Yes.
just cueing somebody, right? Like if they're
Yeah.
not finding the way, a simple cue can sometimes help somebody make that connection. Yeah, we're going to sit here now and I'll listen. Yeah.
I have a question for you.
Yeah.
How would you suggest dealing with verbal abuse? And thank you again for your wonderful presentation. It was very, very helpful. I cared for my sister for a couple of years, and before she became more nonverbal, she was verbally abusive.
Yeah.
And of course, I knew I shouldn't get angry, but I couldn't help it. I was just, I'm a human being and I
Yeah.
was reacting to her verbal abuse. And I knew I shouldn't have, but I wasn't sure how to deal with it other than leaving the room. And when I left the room and came back 5 minutes later, she had forgotten about it. But it's very difficult to accept and to take that sort of thing. Do you have any suggestions other than what I mentioned I did?
Yeah. So yes, and again, I didn't spend a lot of time, but Lewy body dementia, there are some forms of dementia that will cause some personality changes and behaviors that are, inappropriate, that are abusive, language that is inappropriate, um, and anger and aggression, right? So that is definitely hard to deal with. I think some of the things you did are perfect. One, taking care of yourself and removing yourself from a situation where you were feeling abused. Separating yourself from that so you recognize that it's not actually directed at you. It is a symptom that is hard to manage. Um, I will say that sometimes I have been able, and this is in settings like in an adult day health program where we have somebody who screams out or speaks out with abusive or aggressive language, is I can simply say that's not like I can just say that's not appropriate. We don't talk like that, and try to just sort of redirect or cue somebody to let them know that is not the case. I think your strategy of leaving the room for a few minutes and coming back sounds like a great one. So I would offer those ideas. I think, the idea of finding underlying cause. Is there a cause? Is there something that is uncomfortable or distressing to that person? Are they cold? Are they hungry? Do they have to go to the bathroom? Is there something else going on that is causing that you can fix? Or is it simply a particular symptom, right? In which case you have to let it go and then try again. And if they've forgotten, you can move forward and offer something else. I
Okay.
don't know if that's helpful, but those would be my thoughts.
Well,
Yeah.
it was good to hear that I did something that would probably be acceptable.
Yeah. And then, find a way. Is there something you can offer that will invite something that feels more joyful?
Distraction, I think, is always good too. If you're able to provide some form of distraction, get their minds off of whatever seems to be angering them or focusing on something else, I think I found helpful too.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I would say about distraction is maybe to Claudia's point is that yes, redirecting or yes, inviting another response or, kind of creating some space. But I think sometimes distraction can become sort of busy work or like just get them to do something. And I have had more success with finding something that is meaningful. So that when an activity, and I've seen this in a lot of programs where activities are sort of the way to kind of keep people occupied versus an activity as a way to connect, to do something interesting, to respond to what they might be curious about. So, yeah. Frank, were you going to say something else? I saw your hand and then it went away.
Yeah, I was going to say to Roberta's question that it's also important sometimes to get help from a geriatric psychiatrist
Mhm.
uh, if it continues, or like my mother became paranoid. She wasn't so inappropriate with her language with me, but she would hit me. Um, but there was a psychiatric, you know, issue going on that was able to be treated. And then that really helped with medication and she was on it for 5 or 6 years. So, that was really important. The other thing I wanted to say is for me, distraction, what I always try to 1-2 approach, like, oh, look at that bird out there. That's a red cardinal, I think. Do you see the red cardinal? And then I would redirect. She would be going and one, looking out the window, and then I would say, "Oh, let's look at this video on YouTube," which, by the way, is a great thing. You can find anything in the world on YouTube that might interest somebody. Like let's watch I Love Lucy eating chocolates again, and then it was like the bird and the I Love Lucy was enough for her to sort of be in a different space with me, and I did find that was useful as a way of distracting, but just one didn't always work.
Yeah. Yeah. That's great. Thank you. Um, I think, are we at time? Are there any other comments? I'm so grateful for you all. Thank you for joining this. I know that was a lot of information. I spent my time yesterday trying to figure out how to shape it into something that would give an overview and an introduction and also be actionable and helpful. I will say that I feel like in the context of the villages, yeah, I can share the slides. In the context of the villages, I feel like this is an ongoing process and there's much, much more. Frank is a colleague in this area. We were talking yesterday about the ways in which we hope to extend the work throughout the community. So it's like in the water, in the air, so that we can actually make some of these changes. I see a question about what happens in adult daycare. So adult day health centers, I think, are fantastic. Here in Ward 3, Iona Senior Services has one in Tenleytown. Iona also has opened one in Congress Heights. There are others around the city. Genevieve and Johnson Center is one, east of Rock Creek Park. Adult day health are programs specifically to support people with dementia, memory loss, and other conditions that they just need more support. Folks with Parkinson's, folks with aphasia, folks recovering from stroke. They're just supportive social programs that sometimes also have sort of a medical component. So a nurse on site to monitor health conditions, meals, connection, arts programs, physical exercise programs, and other kinds of community programs. In my perfect world, if I ran the world, there would be an adult day health center in every neighborhood. And it would be right next to the child care center. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Thank
you,
you.
Nephelie. This has been wonderful.
Thank you. Should we mention that Palisades Village, we have some programs coming up throughout the summer, partnership with the Fitzgerald, which has a memory support program. We have sort of once a month some programs. One of them is a sort of walk in their shoes program where you experience in a space physically what it might be like to live with dementia. And then the other one coming up in July is actually a Montessori training to help educate community members in the Montessori approach to supporting people with memory loss. And they'll continue throughout the summer. So there's one again in August and September, right, Erica? We have them scheduled
Correct.
throughout the summer.
Correct.
So those are opportunities
Yeah,
for
the next
community
is July
members
11th for the Montessori.
to learn from some of the staff who run the memory support program at Fitzgerald. And certainly I am glad, and others of us are eager to continue the work going forward. So thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everyone. Thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you.